So namaste and welcome to the online Bhakti Yoga Summit. We have someone really, really special in many ways with us today. This is Nina Rao. Nina ji, namaste.
Namaste, nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit about Nina. If you haven't, you probably already know her, but just in case. Nina she learned classical, traditional bhajans or chants in a small village in India with her grandfather when she was about 9 years old. This chant stayed quietly with her till she rediscovered chanting with Krishna Das in New York in 1996. For many years, Nina has been Krishna Das's business manager and his assistant, often touring with him and playing cymbals and singing. In 2007, she recorded her first track, Nina Chalisa, on Krishna Das's CD, Flow of Grace. And in January 2013, she released her debut album, Antaryami, Knower of All Hearts, and her sophomore album, Anubhav, in 2018. Nina regularly leads kirtan workshops, retreats in her hometown of Brooklyn and all around the world. And I have to say, if you haven't heard Antaryami, you have got to hear it. I heard it live in the ashram in the Bahamas, and this word knower of all hearts, the energy of it really actually strikes you, and it's phenomenal. So Nina ji, again, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So if we can just gently begin with Sahana Vavatu, which is a mantra just for inviting harmony in our conversation, and harmony and the tejas or the brilliance of knowledge as it is meant to come to us in this time. So just gently closing your eyes and connecting. Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Saviryam Karvavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vishavahai. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So thank you again, Nina. Nina, you're right that chanting is my vehicle, my path, and my destination. There's just so much in these lines. Can you share with us what Bhakti Yoga means to you now, and perhaps how it might have changed from when you first began on the path? How has Bhakti transformed you?
Well, I think I should just start by saying that I didn't even understand that Bhakti is a path. It was never offered to me in that way, as a child or as a particular practice. I just happened to fall into it because of my family in India. And I realized that it's so much just a part of life in India, and the way in which people look at things. Whatever religion you may come from, there's still something in the culture of India, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Jain, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Catholic, Christian, whatever it might be. There's a sense of a feeling of devotion that's always very close to the surface of everything. And by just being exposed to that all the time, I understood that it was a part of myself, as it is actually a part of everyone. I mean, my feeling about this is that people are devotional by nature. We just choose to be devoted to variety of things. And I think that my first experience of this feeling of devotion as manifested in practice was when I was at my grandfather's place as a child. We used to visit on summer holidays, and he was an engineer for the British government back in the day, and very capable. And he was sort of the most well educated, let's say, and the only person who had a car in his village in Kerala. And we're actually from Karnataka, but the village is just on the border of Kerala. So we, when we went for holidays, he had this house with orchards and rice fields and so on. And one of the things that he had in his house was a harmonium, which I never saw him play until I actually asked him to one day. He was always busy tinkering with, building a well or something or the other was happening. And so the day that I asked him to play harmonium, he said, well, I will, if you will sing along with me. So I said, okay. I had no idea what he was going to sing. And then he called my mother and my aunts and all the people who were living in the house there. And he said, all right. And then he started chanting this prayer to Ganesh. And, you mentioned my album Antarayami. It's actually at the very end of the second disc, where I made a recording of him singing it with us on tape. And then on my CD, I've got him recording and then sort of moving into me chanting with my children and my nieces and nephew and mother and so on. So I just remember that it felt so natural to me to do this call and response practice. I didn't know what he was chanting, but we had been doing some puja practice in his house because he liked to have, how in India we do morning and evening arti. And it felt like the thing to look forward to in the day, to go and blow the shanka and light the lamp and go around to the tulsi plant in the front. All these things that I didn't have because my parents lived abroad. We lived abroad. So we didn't do much of that in the way that they did it there. So that was sort of my first experience. And then we had a satsang at our house, invited village people over to come and hang out, and everybody knew chants. It was a thing that everybody practiced, and you didn't need to be a musician. You didn't know anything. He could play harmonium, but the others were just singing. Others were clapping. And I entered this space that felt so much heart-opening. That's the only word I can think of, because it's peaceful on one hand, blissful on the other at that moment. And then it just ended. And nobody ever talked about it again, because you just don't talk about it. Just do and go on with your life. Until I started chanting with Krishnadas, really by accident, at a yoga retreat. And I understood that when he started chanting, that the place that I went to was the same as I felt when I was a child. And it was at that moment in my life, I was now in my 30s, that I understood that I wanted to do this practice. I didn't even think of it as a practice. I just said, I want to be there when KD is chanting Monday nights at Jivamukti. That was what was happening at the time. And the yoga practice, though I do it for my body, and of course it's good for everything else, my main practice now is chanting, as you know. And so that's sort of when I realized it became a path for me, as it had been for Krishnadas for years before that, which I didn't know because I didn't know him. And, I've stayed with it all this time. And it's taken on a different shape, from chanting with him in a group, but then also me finding my own voice at home, sitting at the altar and singing. And I know you understand this. And then when I was called he asked me to sing on Flow of Grace, it just became a different thing, and people asked me to lead, and then, one thing led to another, and so here we are.
Wow.
But in reference to your original question is that for me, you know, to sustain a practice, and I'm sure this is the case for everybody, so my understanding of the chanting practices is that where it is a vehicle is to take us back into the place in our own hearts. And that is the destination. So all three things, like on a given day, the practice itself could be all of those three things, one of those things, because at this moment in time, I'm so tired. The only thing I can do is sit down and chant. I have no idea what's going to happen. So let me just get into this place of doing the practice every day, no matter how I feel. So it ends up being all three things, because who knows where we're going to end up at any point in time. Ultimately, we know that the chanting practice or any spiritual practice that we might do brings us back into our own hearts, where we are in communion with the divine at all times. We just don't feel it. So, and once we end up staying there forever, then we might have reached our destination. But for right now, it's all of those three things in the best way that I can do it and live my life as a good, you know, in a good way.
Wonderful, yeah. Cheers to forever. So, you know, another thing I was curious about is, you know, there are these prevalent notions, you know, that Westerners don't practice Bhakti Yoga correctly. And there's also this notion that Indians practice Bhakti Yoga only as a religious ritual. What's interesting about your journey is that although you were introduced to Bhakti Yoga when you were just 9 years old, you say, and I quote, that its depth of meaning and validity in your own life was revealed through Western interpretation. Can you speak a little about this, please? Like, how was this depth and meaning revealed through Western interpretation?
Well, as I was saying in my, you know, in my previous, what we were talking about previously, when I had this experience, it was clear to me that it was just a part of everybody's life, and it was never a discussion per se. The other thing that happened during those times was my grandfather also had spiritual texts that were translated into English. Thank goodness for me, because I cannot read Kannada, even though that's what we speak at home. And so I started reading, you know, because we didn't have iPads and phones in those days. I read a lot. So I read the Ramayana, I read Mahabharata. He had 8 volumes of the Krishna Leela. And I really sunk into them, you know, unexpectedly. Nobody asked me to read them or anything, but these stories, they just really spoke to me in a way. And I'm so happy that I did that at that time, because now when I revisit, because I read many different versions now, and I keep going back to it. And I remember once I was in Shivananda, and Edwin Bryant was there, and he was giving a discourse on Bhakti Yoga, and he said, he described Leela as, we keep going back to it. We're never tired of it, because it's not just writing. It's the play of God. And we resonate with that. And so we go back to it over and over again. But again, there was no discussion about it, you know, and so somehow over the years, because I came to the West and I was focused on my profession, occupation, and so forth, because I was, you know, I worked in the banking world and many other things before I started working with Krishna Das. But it was when I went to Krishna Das's retreat and he spoke about his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, and how the presence of this kind of a being changed his life. And the practices that he had done all these years helped him open up into his life in a particular way, is where I understood that the practice is what we need to bridge our world and our lives in the so-called material world to our spiritual heart. It was through him that I understood that. In India, people just do it naturally in the course of their day, but I needed to actually hear that in my mind to understand that, oh, this is why it resonates with me. This is where the separate parts of ourselves, as we see it, can come together and we can unify in a certain way. So I had to hear that from him. And, you know, I always joke about this, that though I'm Indian, I had to come to America to learn the Hanuman Chalisa from a Western guy, Jewish guy from Long Island. You know, I always say this, people find it hilarious, but that's the truth. And it came from him. And in the same way, I think, you know, you had, and I have similar origins in a certain way because of where we were, the families we were born into. I have found that over all these years, my whole family, because of the practice that I started doing with Krishnadas and then on my own, they've all sort of, you know, the tide has brought them back to this practice and they're understanding its importance in their life. And I saw that even more when I planned Krishnadas's tours in India. Whoever thought that he was going to go and chant in India? Like, why? When people invited him, he would say, why would they want me to come? But I watched how it was a revival. And it had to come from the east to the west and sort of back to the east again in a slightly different form. But it's just the shape of the wave and it's all one ocean, really.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I was actually there at his concert in Mumbai.
Yeah.
And that's when I got introduced to his music. You know, someone said, have you heard it? And I'm like, why are you sending me like this white guys?
Yeah.
And when I first heard him, I was like, the accent, it was just hard to like, you know, work with the accent, but then I felt the bhakti and I was like, whoa, this is beautiful. So yeah, I think I'm happy that you shared that, Nina, because, you know, many of us, even in modern India, are very left-brained. And it's hard to make peace with the fact that we're so drawn to this practice that seemingly has no logic. And I mean, we do have some of the speakers on the summit who are going to talk about the neurobiology of bhakti, but, you know, it doesn't seem to have logic. Like, how can you be left-brain, logical, intelligent, you know, whatever, and then still practice bhakti? So I think your sharing really opens us up to having peace with the coexistence of both, and that they really support each other as opposed to are being at loggerheads with each other. Mm-hmm. You know, many people associate bhakti with Hinduism. So there's, I think, a lot of the way that yoga has come to the West and sort of devolved in many ways into just the practice of asana. And of course, asana practice also has bhakti, but that's not really what we see mostly in studios and things like that. It perhaps in part may have to do with trying to keep religion away from yoga, and you know, and the association, in some ways not absolutely correctly, that you have to be a Hindu to practice you know, bhakti yoga. Are you religious, Nina? Do you think it's necessary to believe in God to practice bhakti yoga?
Well, I think the practice of bhakti yoga will help us understand who is God anyway. Is God any different from us? Is God any different from the space that connects all of us? Who are we praying to? And I think that to answer your question, religious I'm not, because I have a hard time conforming to what, you know, some of the directives in many different religions, in whether it's Hindu or Muslim, Christian, whatever. But none of that really matters to me. And I, when you asked me this question, what struck me immediately was, you know, we lived in many places around the world. And one of the schools that I went to when I was very young was when I lived in Thailand. And I went to a Catholic school, actually, because it was one of the few international schools in English medium where I could study. And they had this beautiful chapel on the premises. I don't even know how a school could be like, it's amazing. And the students could go to mass. I don't remember if it was maybe once a week or something. And the rest of us who weren't Catholic were relegated to a moral science class, you know. And I just couldn't bear this moral science class. I said, listen, can I please just go to mass? You know, I won't take communion if I'm not Catholic and I can't take it, but I want to sing those hymns. You know, and those hymns to Jesus and Mary, they called to me so strongly, and they allowed me to go. And the other thing that we had also was library period. I don't know if you had that. We had library period. And the books that I went to read were all stories of Jesus. So from me, the practice of bhakti began before I even understood what it was, which is finding your way back into your so-called spiritual heart and unifying it with everything else that you do in your life. Because ultimately, what does bhakti mean? Bhakti means a sense of devotion to all life, including yourself, and honoring all of that. So yeah, I'm not religious, but wherever I go, we lived in Thailand. We also, that's where I went to Buddhist temples for the first time. And I'm very drawn to Buddhist practices actually now also. I like to hear Buddhist teachers teaching because I find that the framework that they give is very useful to overlay on devotional practices. And it sort of, again, unifies spiritual practices with our own psyche in a way that helps us understand ourselves. And it also empowers you to not only surrender to the practices, but also understand that it's up to us to do the work. We can pray to a being who might be outside of us just because we don't believe that we have our own inner strength to do this. But the Buddhist practices will give you the confidence to understand that it's within your own hands to make it work for you. So there's something to be learned from all the traditions, Sufi mysticism, poetry. I mean, there's so many different ways in which we can feed ourselves. And I think it's important to understand that. People ask me questions all the time about, is it cultural appropriation? This is a word that's thrown around a lot about, when Westerners do Indian practices. I don't have anything to say about that. I learned from a Westerner on some level. Ramdas, great teachings. And so teachings are meant to be shared wherever they come from. And each as a practitioner, we should do the best as we can to find where the classical traditional teachings are. Go find them. And then practice in the best way that you can, as close as possible to the tradition, because tradition is worth something. The reason why there is tradition is it's lasted over the years. It's worked for everybody. So I do my best to do that. I cannot read Tibetan. So I read Tibetan texts that have been interpreted by people who are steeped in the tradition, but they're Westerners and they write in English. So does that make it any less valid? I don't think so. You have the Dalai Lama, you have the Karmapa, you have Indian teachers coming from India and teaching Westerners all the way back when from Vivekananda when he came here, in the 1800s. So I think the teaching should be shared, but we should all do the best we can to deepen our practice and try to go to the roots of where those practices might have come from and see what we can learn from them.
Yeah. It's very beautiful how you put it, because and bringing up this topic of cultural appropriation, which is really sort of like gaining momentum right now, because I think in this context the practice of aparigraha, non-stealing, is important to say, okay, like I learned this practice from this lineage or these teachers and I'm sharing it to the best of my ability and knowledge, and then that way make peace with where we are in our own journeys, because even the greatest masters, there's always more to learn, right? And there's always more to surrender, even more so. So I think, thank you. You sort of preempted something I was going to ask you, just to bring that into a context of ahimsa, really, with these sort of new topics, cultural appropriation and spiritual bypassing, just new things that we never heard before. In this, this also brings me to another sort of maybe a little controversial topic in these days, which I think is important to sort of share about, this idea of of the guru. And the guru, there's just so much, there's so many kinds of gurus that are mentioned, but usually the word is used as a sort of monolithic term. And in traditional bhakti, there is also bhakti towards that you feel towards your guru. And I know that you have such a strong relationship with your own guru. And I would like if you could speak a little bit about what bhakti feels like in a relationship with a living teacher, and how people can really also see that other side of guru, because mostly you hear only about gurus that were abusive, or gurus that took advantage of power, or gurus that expected blind faith and surrender. But there's also these beautiful nuances of relationships we have with our gurus that we don't usually talk about, because these are very intimate relationships. Generally, traditionally, we're told not to speak about. But I'm requesting if you could share a little bit about how bhakti unfolds in a relationship with a guru, with a mentor, in a living sort of relationship with another living being in that depth.
I understand your question. The first time that I heard chanting with my grandfather, we didn't have a family guru when I grew up. We did have a photo of Shirdi Sai Baba was in our home. But my grandfather hadn't met Shirdi Sai Baba because it was before his time. But he felt some relationship with Shirdi Sai Baba. And that comes from the devotees. The devotees, I believe, carry the guru in their hearts, and it might have the particular shape of one particular guru, but the feeling is the same. And that's all that we can devote ourselves to, is that feeling. What else are we bowing down to? So when I met Krishnadas, I think what came through to me was his love and devotion to his Guru Neem Karoli Baba. And in my early conversations with him, I said, I feel really sad, actually, after this retreat, the first time that I met him, because I won't have a chance to meet Neem Karoli Baba, because he's already left the body. And, he said to me, you don't need a guru, and the guru comes to you, and all the things that people tell you. And I was really irritated. And I said, that's all very fine for you to say, but now you've met your guru, you had him, and people ask him this question all the time. But what he did say to me at that time, and so I said, okay, at the very least, I need to go to Kenchi. Like, I feel that pull so strongly, which is the temple where he spent most of his time with his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, in Kenchi as well as in Vrindavan. But I felt I wanted to go to the hills. So he said, okay, well, when you go, I will write you a letter so that you can meet Siddhima. And Siddhima was Maharaji's, one of his very closest disciples, but to whom he entrusted the cares of the temple. Maharaji had many very close devotees, but Siddhima was one of them, but the care of the temples was in her hands. So I went to India in 1998 to Kenchi. It took me 2 years to get there after meeting Krishnadas, just because of life, and we got there. And I had such hopes in my heart that I was going to have this, epiphany, and like this, the sun would twirl and stars would fall on me, and like all kinds of things when I met her. It wasn't like that at all. And when I met her, my memory of it is that I couldn't even actually see her with my eyes, which was really interesting. All I could see was like this feeling of this person, this being, in a very expansive space that I understood as Maharaji because of her devotion to Maharaji. So, we need all these visuals, we need names, we need, I don't even know what, to kind of create, to define a space in which to be, and we seem to need to define it always. So that was my first feeling when I was with her. But then it did personalize, because I ended up spending a lot of time with her, and she showed me that she saw me. She really saw me, and she saw me, and she loved me, and she accepted me the way that I am. And a lot of devotees will talk about unconditional love from their guru. And that's a very hard word for me to speak, so I don't. But what I like to say is that, because I don't feel capable of unconditional love, so I don't really know what that means. But what I do know is that, and I say this all the time, and which is why antaryami was such an important word for me, is that, it's used in different ways. It's used often as the indwelling presence that exists in all of us. But antaryami means like that presence that lives in our own hearts, like our own cave of our heart, the hridaya, like where we go as refuge. And that heart knows you. She knows. So that's the place where we can trust in our own selves. And that's why I find it very important to remember that when we have choices to make in our lives, when we have emotional reactions to things, when we have decisions to make, when we have, because in the world we have to live in, there are certain boundaries that we have to set with people, with situations, in order to just preserve the state of our well-being, So how do we make those decisions? We have to go to that guru. That guru lives inside there. That guru is no different than the guru that's outside of us, who might manifest as Siddhima in my case. So in answer to your question, I did go to her, for 20 years, and I saw her for short periods of time. And in those short periods of time, I was able to get certain instructions. And these instructions were very simply about things that were going on in my life. I took my daughter with me. She would tell me things about how to raise her. I got married and divorced in front of her. She gave me advice about all that. But when I think back to what I learned from her, it was all seeing her as a model. She embodied everything that she said. There were no teachings like that, that she expounded in any way that could be written in a book. But the simplicity of her living, the clarity with which she looked at things, and her devotion to Maharaji and to practice was the greatest teaching she could have ever given me. And she did that by not only telling us to do practice, but by also being a living example of that. Everything she did, food that was prepared in the temple, the way the temple was kept clean and nice for everybody, the way she opened, forget about cultural appropriation. Are you kidding? She had us, I consider myself a Westerner, and I, had a lot of Western friends with me, and I was fortunate enough to translate for her because I could speak Hindi and translate for the Americans who were with me. And, she had us doing practice. She had us singing Hanuman Chalisas out in the open in the temple area where all the Indians were coming. So what am I going to say about that? It was all about the sharing of the practice. And if you did it, you could share. And we, all of you go out and sit there, take chai and go and sit out there and chant. And it wasn't just me. Anybody who was with us, everybody chant, So for me, I understood that, while I was going to Neem Karoli Baba's temples, and she sits inside of him in the same way that when I go to see any of these other teachers, whoever it might be, who I feel are very connected to that divine space. So I go to sit with His Holiness Dalai Lama, or I go and see the 17th Karmapa when he comes and sees. It's not different. The space that they're in is Siddhima space. It's not any different. But I did have a personal relationship, and for that I am very grateful. As much as, we are sad that she's not with us in the body anymore, I feel that I'm still with her and she's still with me. That connection's not lost.
Yeah. Could really feel that.
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to do the summit sometimes because I just want to go into silence and feel that energy, but I've got to keep asking questions. So, another thing that you've touched upon a little is the need to actually commit to a sadhana. Sometimes this because love is such an expansive, non-boundary um, experience and practice. We can sometimes maybe delude ourselves, perhaps thinking that I just need to be loving, and that I don't need to have a sadhana. And maybe for some people that works, it flows naturally based on their temperament. But there is importance for a regular committed sadhana as well. Can you share, if you think that it must be a committed sadhana, or if it's just a gift of grace, or that the sadhana unlocks the grace that is always there? Can you speak a little about this sort of rigor or this discipline that is required for sadhana and its place in bhakti?
Well, we'll just start with the first thing you said, which is like, is it okay to just be loving? Yes, but can we do it? Can we really do it? I mean, come on, let's be honest with ourselves. We can have that intention, and it's the best intention, because that's what we want to be. We want to be love. We want to be that guru that is accepting, that's compassionate, no matter what's happening, and have peace of mind at the same time. And my understanding is that without having this awareness all the time that our hearts are covered with all kinds of obscurations, and those obscurations don't have anything to do with anybody else. We're born with them. It's a result of the life that we've lived, and we're here to work it out. First, we have to take notice of what those are. So if you look at any of the prayers that we sing, I mean, let's think about what we're asking God for. We're asking for, take away my anger. Chandipat, all the prayers to the goddess are the goddess who tears apart thought. Let's just think about that. The goddess who tears apart thought, let's just think about that. But let's just become aware of what's going on here. We want to be loving. Of course we do. We want to be love. But it's not easy to do. It's not easy to it's not easy to remove the coverings of our heart where the love actually is. We are already that, but we have so many other things going on. We've got anger, we've got jealousy, we have envy, we have a self-loathing, unworthiness. I mean, just the whole gamut, from minor irritations to like full-on incense and anger, and we all have it in us. It's there, and they arise on various occasions. And I've just understood that without doing some kind of practice, because these practices have the power to change that. But you can't do them when you're in a state of imbalance. You could be grief-stricken. I mean, there are times that you can do that as well, and you can use it as a way to get through these emotions. But what we want to try and do is use these practices to fortify our hearts in such a way that no matter what comes to us, because there's no warning about what's going to happen next. You could bump your knee on the edge of this bed when you're walking out of the room and be like, God damn. Or so many things can happen, right? We have no way what's going to come to us. So the only thing we can do is, if we can dedicate a few minutes of the day, however long you can make it. If it's 5 minutes, it takes 5 minutes to chant your japa on your mala, or do whatever prayer it is that you want to do. If you can just commit to that, it will work on its own inside of us, so that we are more ready to face what comes to us. And if we don't even really like the way in which we reacted to a particular situation, it actually enhances our awareness of our own reactions, so that it's not so knee-jerk all the time. And be like, okay, wait, maybe this time I can handle it a little differently. And then the next time something else comes up, you might be surprised at how you've accepted what's come to you in a certain, with a certain kind of openness and less evaluation and less judgmental sort of reaction. And with that, we develop greater peace of mind, because I think peace of mind just comes with acceptance of everything that's coming to us, and not having preferences about the way they should be. Because that's most of our problem, is that we have preferences, we have expectations, and when the expectations are not met, we feel victimized. So the way to move through that, my understanding is, of course, see a therapist, because that's always helpful. Talk to people, be open about your vulnerabilities, you know, and understand that we're not perfect beings. We are perfect beings on the inside, but we're so judging of ourselves that we have to find a way to get to that place where everything is okay, which doesn't mean bypassing. It means dealing with what's coming to you. How do you deal? You talk about it, and you do practice to help you meet that moment. It's worked for hundreds and thousands of years, and my guru, she said, it's the only way. She'd say to me, she said, "Tum socho mat, paat karo." Don't think, go and pray. It's very simple.
Yeah.
Very lovingly.
Yeah. I'm always talking to my daughter about firm love. um, one last question before we sort of close is something that, you know, I've been sort of looking for answers for, this experience of being in surrender, Ishvara Pranidhana, Narayanayati Samarpayami. How do, like I always say, how do I explain this to someone who is in the West? Because surrender is looked at as something which is was below, as something that has to do with defeat as opposed to with courage. You know, it's always like, let's fight against cancer and fight against COVID, and everything's about getting up there and doing. But in bhakti, surrender is not defeat. Surrender is not giving up. It's something more. You know, to put it very, very blankly, how do you sell surrender as a practice, or invite people into surrender in the practice of bhakti, like left brain, sort of like, I've got to do bhakti practice, you know, like it's something I've got to do and tick off my list in my sadhana. How do you bring this, how do you unfold this experience of surrender, or is it just grace? What are your thoughts on this, Nina?
What other option do we have? You know, ultimately, you know, Ramdas said these words, you know, be here now. And there's like 3 very simple words. But what that entails is all of the things that we've talked about. Because the only way that we can actually move through our lives, and I say this again and again, is to have peace of mind and peace of heart. Because without that, we can't even do the things. It doesn't imply that we shouldn't be activists and we shouldn't stand up for the things that we think are right and good for people. But if we do it with anger, it doesn't serve. It doesn't serve anybody. You just make everybody else angry, and you're angry. So how is this useful? You know, so we have to find a way to cultivate, to use all the attributes that are necessary. So for example, in the Hanuman Chalisa, we invoke the qualities of Hanuman, of wisdom, courage, strength, compassion, and also patience. If you read the whole Ramcharitmanas, it's all about patience. So all these qualities can come together in a way where you can have compassionate activism. But until you surrender to the situation as it is, and everybody's part in the situation as it is, we're never going to have a launch pad from where to activate. So that surrender is surrendering to the moment as it is now. It's not necessarily surrendering to a situation in a way that it should continue to be that way. It just means acknowledging what is now. And then when you get there, it's a very expansive moment. And, Ram Dass said a very beautiful thing at one point. And I always remember this. I'm bad at remembering quotes, but this one I remember really well. He said, a moment is not in space and not in time. But when we dive into that moment, there is Maharaji. So Maharaji in this context, or in every context, is that space of unconditional love and compassion and expansiveness where the whole universe is held. And if we can even just touch that space for just a moment, but to get there, you have to surrender to the fact that, we can't will ourselves into that space. And so, yes, it is grace on some level. But if you can enter into that flow of grace by even having the awareness that one has to surrender to that space, then by practice and by grace, you'll get there. So surrender, like Krishna said a beautiful thing once. He said, the ultimate act of power is surrender. Think about that.
Beautiful. So one last question, if someone is new to the practice of bhakti, say they're even hearing about bhakti yoga for the first time, but their heart's open, maybe they've been practicing asana a lot, where would you say is a good starting point to dive into the practice of bhakti? What would you suggest they do?
I think that there's some things that I love to do. They talk about the 9 forms of bhakti that we can practice, and I will let your scholarly teachers explain all that. But for me, remembering saints. So in my case, I have Siddhima in my life, but I also read about other saints all the time, because it helps me enter into that space. And many times these stories of saints are written by devotees. They're not written by the saints themselves, not autobiographical. But, a lot of people entered the spiritual path by reading, autobiography of a yogi. There are so many books out there now, especially you can find all kinds of things. Read about Sri Ramakrishna, read about Sri Sharda Devi, read about Sri Shirdi Sai Baba, listen to Amma's talks online. I mean, anything. There's like a multitude of things. So you can get the feeling of what it's like to be with these kind of beings who live in that space of devotion all the time. Raman Maharshi, so many different saints. Anandamayi Ma. Doing just simple mantra practice, whether you do japa, you do chanting of the mantras, in a musical way, or you dive deeper into more extended prayers, like prayers to the goddess, or, Adi Shankaracharya's prayers, or reading poetry. I'm reading this amazing book here about these Tibetan nuns who, actually these are Buddhist nuns from Burma, who wrote beautiful prayers about loving kindness. Anything that can take you into that space where people are pointed in that direction. Follow them. Get on the same path with them. And whatever resonates with you, the people who like to do the mystical dances of Sufism, like whirling dervishes, find it. Whatever that is, so much out there. I love to listen to Benedictine monks chanting, you know, it's infinite. We just have to just reach out, you know, or like they say in Zen Buddhism, you know, cup your hands because grace is raining down on you all the time.
I'm going to cup my hands in Anjali Mudra and say thank you, Nina. Thank you so much for this heart pouring. Thank you.
Well, it's because of you we're doing this. You know, when we remember the saints, they come.
Thank you.